attracted an online audience about the size of the audience here in the room with us today. I want to thank our sponsors, Related Southeast, First Republic Bank, and the Smith Architectural Group for helping to underwrite this lecture series, and to the museum staff for all the hard work they do behind the scenes to make this possible. I want to remind you to silence your cell phones, if you would, please. Just take a second to make sure those are turned off. And if you happen to have an audio tour wand with you, please hold that up so one of the staff can collect it. They have an internal alarm system that can sometimes be set off by the AV system here at the museum. And now it's my pleasure to welcome for our third lecture, a lecture on Stanford White, Samuel White, the great-grandson of Stanford White, who is himself an architect. Samuel White has been an architect for nearly half a century. His diverse portfolio of educational, institutional, and residential projects include the modernization of the Stanford White Astor Courts in Rhinebeck, the expansion of the Garden House at the Packer College Collegiate Institute in Brooklyn, renovations to the Temple Israel on New York's Upper East Side, the Net Zero Energy Dormitory for the Center of Development Economics at Williams College, an expansion of the St. David's School in New York, the restoration of the cast iron facades of 462 Broadway, the rehabilitation of the historic Bay Head Yacht Club in New Jersey, the design of the Poly Prep Lower School in Park Slope, and on and on and on. In fact, he, I think, was the architect for the first LEED certified school in New York City. His projects have earned him the Lucy Moses Preservation Award from the New York Landmarks Conservancy. He's a trustee or an advisor on a number of educational and arts organizations, and for more than a decade, he's been an adjunct professor for the fine arts at New York University. Among his books, the books he has authored are The Houses of McKim, Mead, and White, McKim, Mead, and White, The Masterworks, and Stanford White, the architect, and a book called Nice House. We have a couple of his books, in fact, available after the lecture that I'm sure he'd be happy to sign for you. So please join me in welcoming Samuel White to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
We're on. Thank you, John. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. The book that John mentioned, actually you didn't mention, is the little one. It's called Stanford White in Detail. Is the latest one that we wrote. It's actually the only one of the Stanford White books that you can hold up with one hand. So it's highly recommended in that respect. That book takes a very close look at the ornamental details that enrich and animate Stanford White's work, and they are really ornamental. And that book is like a box of chocolates without any calories. I really recommend it in that respect. But this afternoon, what I'd like to do is to turn the lens around and take a broader look at the themes that connect Stanford White's work across the span of his career. And those themes include his collaborations with other artists and architects, the unique manner in which he used ornament, which is the subject of this book that I mentioned, and most particularly the source of the inspiration for his remarkable designs. I believe that that inspiration arose from a synthesis of two factors, his memory and his imagination. Now, most of us are still holding on to our memories, and we all have imagination to some extent. But in Stanford White's case, that combination was like rocket fuel. He was able to take historic precedents and reinterpret them in ways that were both authentically original and at the same time reassuringly familiar. And the really dazzling effects that he achieved with this make him one of the most important designers in the history of American architecture. Well, the facts of Stanford White's life are pretty straightforward. He was born in New York in 1853. He was murdered in 1906. And at the age of 17, he was apprenticed to Henry Hobson Richardson, who was the most important living American architect at the time. He worked for Richardson for 6 years, leaving for a 14-month sabbatical to Europe to sketch, and then returned in 1879 to go into partnership with Charles McKim and William Rutherford Mead. Their combination of compatible personalities and different, but also I think, complementary artistic temperaments was an instant success, and they went very quickly from really over a 30, 25-year period, from being a small atelier of 12 architects to becoming the largest and most famous architecture firm in the country. Stanford White was born with his imagination, but he started accumulating memory while he was working with Richardson. This photograph was probably taken at that time, and in the mid-1870s, together with his friends William Mead and Charles McKim, they were not partners yet, they just knew each other because the architectural community was very small in New York, took what they would later refer to as their celebrated New England walking tour, a trip up to Salem, Massachusetts and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to look at examples of late colonial and early federal period houses such as the Gardner Pingree House by Samuel McIntyre in Salem. And Stanford White was not ready to become a federal revival architect at this time. He obviously admired what he saw, but it would be years before this became part of his palette of styles. But I think right from the start he sort of fell in love with the front door of this house. The front doors of these federal period houses are really like a combination of street furniture and eye candy. I mean, they just have amazing appeal as you walk by them. And 25 years after Stanford White saw this, he was able to use that door in a house in Southampton that you may know, a house for Jimmy Breeze, then called the Orchard, now called the Whitefield Condominium. And the house is a Palladian plan with a series of pavilions that are linked by hyphens. And as you pass through the house, you go from pavilion to pavilion, but passing through the hyphens, they're treated as outdoor spaces that even have front doors, as you see here. Well, when White left to go to Europe in 1878, he traveled mostly in northern France and filled dozens of sketchbooks with drawings like this. And these drawings start to give you a clue about kind of the eye and mind of Stanford White. That in addition to the technical skill, I mean, Mead would later describe Stanford White as being able to draw like a house on fire. But in addition to that, you see what he's really interested in, which is the rendering of these textures, which are so dense that they approach saturation. Textures that are first revealed by and then dissolved by light, surfaces that are not quite surfaces. I mean, look at the shingles on the left, the little glass windows and that great gable on the right. That's what Stanford White was really interested in, and you'll see it throughout his career. He made this drawing in the northern France. This is the Chateau de Plessis-Marseille, a house in near Anjou. And I think Stanford White sort of was attracted by its sort of medieval disreputability almost. I mean, it's got a very charming quality to it. And so he draws this, and you can see that he's very taken by the sort of the irregularity of the roof line, those gables popping up here and there, the texture of the underside of that projecting dormer, the arch over the corner doorway. And he doesn't have to wait 25 years to sort of recycle this particular memory. Within 6 months, he's back in New York working on the interior courtyard of the Newport Casino, where you see the Chateau de Plessis-Marseille rendered in shingles with a lot more discipline than what the medieval structure had been. Well, the trip to Europe started with a 1-month trip down the Rhone with Charles McKim and Augusta St. Gaudens. The three of them were these pals who took a trip down the Rhone to look at Romanesque architecture. They were still sort of in the thrall of Henry Hobson Richardson, and so they go down to just about as far as Avignon. And at the end of that trip, St. Gaudens made this medal for private circulation among the protagonists, and there you see the three characters. There is St. Gaudens with his pointed beard, there is McKim with his high forehead, and there is Stanford White looking like he's just stepped on a third rail, which is probably how he looked most of the time. The rest of the medal is filled with sort of references to some of the undergraduate hijinks that they got into in the course of this, and then also some of the architecture that they saw, including that church in the upper right-hand corner. That is the Cathedral of Saint-Gilles-du-Gard in a town near Avignon. And Stanford White saw this, and he wrote to his mother that this was the finest piece of architecture in all of France. Well, Stanford White was given to uncritical superlatives, but it is a terrific piece of architecture. And 25 years after he saw this, Stanford White is able to pull the memory up for a commission from Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt to create a set of memorial doors in honor of her late husband for St. Bartholomew's Church, which at that time was at 44th Street and Madison Avenue in this Renwick church you see right here. So there are White's doors, and 25 years after White did this, the congregation moved another 20 blocks to the south to 51st Street and Park Avenue. And they were so enamored of their doors by Stanford White that they insisted that the new church, which was designed by Goodhue, include the Stanford White doors. Now, Goodhue was a good sport, and you can see that this was not an easy fit, but he did it, and we are the beneficiaries for the preservation of elements that are not always preserved. McKim went back to, after the month, McKim went back to New York to work with Mead in their office, and Stanford White went off to the north of France to sketch, and St. Gaudens went back to Paris, where he was working on this commission. This is the David Glasgow Farragut Memorial. This was the commission that really launched St. Gaudens' career. It moved him into the first rank of American sculptors. It really redefined sculpture for Americans. It's a very, very interesting piece. You look at it and you see that St. Gaudens has captured a kind of a psychological instant that Farragut has seen something on the horizon and he's just tensing his left arm to reach for his binoculars. I mean, this is a really insightful work. Well, St. Gaudens invited Stanford White to participate with him on this, and Stanford White could design the base, and Stanford White saw this as an opportunity to swing for the fences. This was not going to be a sort of a subordinate base to hold a great statue. This was going to be something that got equal, if not greater, billing than what St. Gaudens was coming up with, and it's a terrific piece. It's in Madison Square, and it's filled with these allegorical figures, a lot of text carved onto the side, and then the whole thing is shaped as this curved bench, this exedra, which is inviting you to come and sit at the feet of the war hero. I mean, this is the next insight into Stanford White's work, that his designs engage the observer. This is not looking at Stanford White's work is not a passive activity, that he insists that you almost participate in the enjoyment of the work. The two artists signed the work on the back of this crab, which is set at the base of the statue in Pebble Dash, which is one of Stanford White's favorite motifs. And what this shows is Stanford White had this real taste for the decorative character of these slightly bizarre animals. He does it again with this abstracted spider's web, which is on a balcony rail in the 7th Regiment Armory on 65th Street and Park Avenue. This is in a room called the Silver Room in the Veterans Rooms. The whole thing was a collaboration, but this particular room is really Stanford White at work. I mean, all of those elements, the ceiling pattern, the fireplace, the patterns on the wood, these are all elements that show up in Stanford White's work in the early period. But the rest of it was truly a collaboration with this group. It was called the Associated Artists, led by Louis Comfort Tiffany, and included Tiffany, who's in the lower left, Candace Wheeler on the lower right. She designed the fabrics. In the upper left is Lockwood DeForest, who looks like he's getting ready to go to a costume party. He imported decorative woods and furniture and carvings from India. And then in the upper right is Samuel Coleman, a painter for whom Stanford White had designed a house later, or would design a house later in Newport. And they were interior decorators. They were professional interior decorators. They did the Havemeyer House in New York. They did a room in the White House. They did the Mark Twain House in Hartford, which is still there. And for one commission, they had Stanford White join them, and that was for this room here, the Veterans Room at the 7th Regiment Armory, a room that really redefines the concept of visual overload. It's a room in which it's impossible to tell with any certainty, other than the case of the windows, who was responsible for what. It's a room that my firm actually had the privilege of restoring a number of years ago, but it is one of the most, if not the most important aesthetic period room in America. It's an extraordinary room, and I recommend a visit if you are in New York. Well, for this, Stanford White was really the kind of low man on the totem pole in this collaboration, but he would eventually become the leader of these collaborations of artists and architects most artists mostly. This is the Church of the Ascension down on Lower Fifth Avenue and 9th Street, 10th Street. And this was a project that he did with Louis St. Gaudens, who's in the upper right. It's John Lafarge, the lower right. John Lafarge was the painter who did the great mural of the Rising Christ. St. Gaudens was the brother of Augustus, did those angels over the altar, and then Maitland Armstrong on the lower left, who did the mosaics. And the goal here was to create a chancel in a room that had been designed by Upjohn for a very low church congregation who didn't want a chancel. In fact, they instructed Upjohn that you should never be able to put a chancel in this church because chancels were the scene of all kinds of popish doings. And so Upjohn backs the rectory right up to the end of the nave. And so 25 years later, the congregation has moved theologically to the left or the right, depending on your point of view. They want a chancel. And so Stanford White is hired to create a chancel where Upjohn had made pretty sure there could be none. White does it in this extremely clever way by taking over the last bay of the nave and so cladding it all in marble, but then signs the whole thing with this little peacock, again, showing his taste for these slightly bizarre animals. Well, the greatest of White's collaborations, obviously, were those with Charles McKim and William Rutherford Mead. And at the beginning, they were working in Richardson's old office down on 57 Broadway, and it could not have been a very big space. And you know, those days, drafting tables took up a lot of room. And the work of the early period of McKim, Mead, and White shows the consequences of what happens when you put two very strong designers, in this case McKim and White, in one very small space, that there's this kind of struggle for participation or even control over the projects. And an example of that is the Samuel Tilton House in Newport, where here is the south elevation, and you see the strong two-story off-center bay. You see the windows organized into continuous horizontals, and then the whole composition is sort of wrapped up in a bow with that giant roof. This is 100% pure McKim. This is the McKim paradigm at work. So clearly, he got the south elevation. But as you move your way around the house, you see Stanford White clawing his way back into the game. I mean, gone are those continuous horizontals, a real mix of different materials, and you start to see things that Stanford White had seen in the course of his trip to the northern part of France. The sgraffito panel in the upper right is broken bits of shells and stones pushed into wet cement to create an image. You see the half timbering on the left with a pebble dash infill, and then below that you see that stained glass window or leaded glass window with sort of the density that approaches saturation that I was talking about before. Well, as you move around to the north elevation, Stanford White is completely in control of this elevation, and you see all of the things that you saw before, plus this gigantic sgraffito panel, which has bits of broken beer bottles stuck into it. I mean, White must have gotten up on the scaffold to do this himself, because you could never communicate something like this in a drawing or in a letter. So this is an autograph Stanford White, I would say. When it came to the interiors, it was not a competition for participation. It was really a clear allocation of roles. McKim and Mead had invited Stanford White to join the firm because they knew that they were not capable of doing interiors at the level that they wanted, and they saw Stanford White initially as an interiors guy. So the plan is McKim. It's based on a thing called the Living Hall Plan, which was developed by Richardson, in which there is a space in the center of the house that is sort of operationally and spiritually sort of the heart of the house. The rooms fly off it like rooms off a pin, or blades off a pinwheel, but it has the staircase, it has a bunkhead, it has the fireplace, it's near the front door. It's really the wonderful thing about shingle-style houses. There is, those of you who go to the Met, there's a terrific shingle-style staircase from the Metcalf House, and the McKim, Mead, and White House, preserved in the Met, so you can see it there. But so while the plan was McKim, and so thanks to Richardson, the interior design is Stanford White, and I think you would have to say that they got the right guy. White would collaborate vertically within the firm as well as with others. This is a picture of a man named Joseph Morrill Wells, who was the first employee hired by McKim, Mead, and White. He was Stanford White's exact contemporary, born in 1853, like Stanford White, he had graduated from high school, but then his architectural training consisted of apprenticeships after that. He had no formal or academic architectural training, but he went to work for McKim, Mead White, and he became the principal designer in the drafting room. He was Stanford White's right-hand man, absolutely an indispensable person. He was later offered a partnership in the firm by McKim, which he turned down, saying that he would never put his name on so much damn bad work. So I mean, he's a real ordinary son of a gun, but ornery. But anybody who runs an office knows that these people are really important. I mean, this is the burr in your shoe that makes it all work. I'd say his most acknowledged contribution to the work of McKim, Mead White was the elevations of the Villard houses on Madison Avenue and 51st Street. Stanford White had worked on it to the extent of coming up with a plan that arranged 6 separate townhouses to look like one large urban palazzo. And then Stanford White left to go to New Mexico to see his brother, leaving Wells to develop the elevations. And up until this point, McKim, Mead White's elevations were sort of modernized Richardsonian. They were sort of smoothed over. What Wells decided was that it was in time to grow up, and he saw the Italian Renaissance as the paradigm for doing that, and he developed the elevations for the Villard houses as sort of modeled after the Palazzo della Cancelleria in Rome. You know, he couldn't have done this without the support of the partners, but I think that he was the kind of the engine that was pushing them in that direction. And the eventual sort of development of McKim, Mead White as classical architects, I think, really starts with Joseph Morrow Wells. Well, Stanford White comes back from New Mexico and gets right to work on the interiors. This is a collaboration between White and St. Gaudens, Augusta St. Gaudens, a zodiac clock, which shows that Stanford White's imagination is running at full throttle. And then for the rest of the interiors, it seems as though Stanford White and Joseph Morrow Wells are in competition with each other to see who can spend more of Henry Villard's money. And Villard did not seem to be able to say no, which was a mistake on his part at the end. Fabulous, fabulous interiors. I mean, look at that. The stair hall is covered with sienna marble. Those are Maitland Armstrong windows in the background. And then look at the balusters, which look like sort of embroidery rendered in stone, or the capitals with those upturned volutes and the wagon wheel rosettes. Remember, Villard's money came from railroads. They just put everything they could into it. I mean, this was the 100-hour-a-week example. And in fact, it did take its toll on Joseph Morrow Wells because he died early. He died in 1891 and is buried in Oak Grove Cemetery in Medford, Massachusetts, under this stone designed by Stanford White and carved by Augusta St. Gaudens. And you look at this and then you look around the cemetery and you realize that when it sort of came to an ideal of beauty, that Stanford White was just on a different planet from the rest of the world. Well, White, as they say in baseball, could play every position. And an example of this is a house in a place called Cornwall, Pennsylvania, which is near, it's like 5 or 6 hours away from New York, I mean, near Lancaster. And it must have been a huge train ride because there couldn't have been direct train connections to Cornwall. This is the house. And when the commission came in from Percy Aldrin, I think that McKim and Mead probably told Stanford White that as the junior partner, it was his job to go out to check out the site. And so Stanford White goes and gets on the ferry and then the train, and sort of 6 or 7 or 8 hours later, however long it takes, gets to the site and he looks at it, and then he goes back to the station and takes the 6 or 7 hour train ride back into New York. And I am convinced that by the time that train arrived back in New York, Stanford White had designed this house because it has everything that he is interested in and nothing of what McKim is interested in. Starting with the form, I mean, it's a much more complex form than McKim ever would allowed. That very medieval porte cochere with its half timbering, that's pink stucco, not a McKim color. The house, there's a great arch over the stair window. The house is painted, clapboard, and shingles rather than natural. And then White goes and signs it everywhere he can with these sgraffito panels. I mean, just every time you turn a corner, you see Stanford White saying, "This was mine." My favorite part of this house on the outside is this great bay that leads up to a balcony, and that roof that is this sort of two different roof pitches, this candle snuffer roof. I mean, whoever thought that flashing could be so decorative? And then that sort of wonderful starburst at the top of it, and those two groaning columns. I mean, remember, Stanford White believed in the architecture of empathy. He wanted you to participate in appreciating his work, and you can really look at those columns and feel the weight that they are supporting. Inside, Stanford White's imagination is at work. This is the entrance hall, and you see White's taste for, this is an aesthetic period taste for elements from exotic countries. You see the ceiling is based on a book called The Elements of Arab Art, which was published in Paris in 1850. You have those two lanterns that look like they've escaped from the Seraglio. And then at the bottom of the staircase, you have that screen of pegged pieces of wood. That's called a mashrabia screen, and it was something developed in North Africa as a way of providing ventilation and privacy. But what White liked about it was that as the sun passed through it, it revealed the kind of the density of the pattern, and then the more sun that passes through, the more it kind of dissolves this pattern. So you see a lot of mashrabia screens in early Stanford White work. This room also shows White working with compression and release as a way of kind of moving you through the house. And the compression, in this case, occurs at two levels. It occurs at a physical level. I mean, this is not a very big space for the entrance to a country house. Then it occurs at a visual level. I mean, Stanford White is using every trick in the book. He can't find another empty space to try another device. I mean, look at all the different motifs that he has squeezed into this one room. But as you pass through that portal there, you come into the release part of this equation, which is the 2.5-story hall. And here, you not only have the greater space, but the ornament and the way its walls are treated is much quieter. The walls, the half timbering is flush with the plaster. The plaster just has little gold stars stenciled on it, so there's no pebble dash or anything like that. The fireplace is a highly domesticated version of a medieval fireplace, and then the sort of 12 stained glass windows at the end of the room sort of again allow light to come in and reveal this detail, and then ultimately when the sun shines, dissolve it. Well, there's, when you get to the dining room, White's imagination is going at full speed. He paints the ceiling blue and he glues fishnet to the ceiling and then covers the upper walls with that woven cane. The lower walls are covered with marquetry blocks, and then there is this sideboard, which if you look at the cornice suggests that it is a built-in sideboard, but if you look at the legs, it suggests that it's a freestanding piece of furniture. And this I call the, Stanford White sort of exploring the estuarial middle ground between architecture and furniture. I mean, he really loved the ambiguity of these things, and he just tickled that nerve as often as he could. There's a painted room in the house, a sitting room where White is working with his favorite color scheme of gold leaf on ivory color. He's working with his vocabulary of non-Vitruvian moldings. And then if you look at the frame around what would have been the mirror on the left, he's interested in this really tight texture of little beads which are picked out in gold leaf. And those are very much like the frames that Stanford White was designing at this time. Stanford White was the great frame designer in America in the late 19th century. You can recognize his frames from 2 galleries away in any American wing or any museum with an American collection. They're still made in reproduction, but the originals are something else altogether. Here's another Stanford White frame. This one is a more Renaissance motif, but it's the same sort of surface that's not quite a surface, interest in very dense texture. This encloses a bas-relief by Augustus St. Gaudens of Bessie Springs Smith, and it was a gift to Stanford White on the occasion of his marriage to Bessie in February 1884. So from this point on, Stanford White becomes a married man. They go on a honeymoon, they go to the Mediterranean, they may stop in Spain, they certainly go to Constantinople because that's where that photograph of the young architect was taken. Every young architect should have one. But they spent most of their time, I think, in Italy, traveling up and down the peninsula, and it was there that Stanford White came to the conclusion that in order to succeed as an architect, which he said, the way he said it was to make New York City a beautiful town, because it was really pretty ugly stuff. That the model had to be the architecture of Italy. And so he looked at Italy as really examples of what he could bring home. And he looked, for example, this is the Church of Santa Maria in Cosmedin. This is the church where you take your 12-year-old to stick his or her hand in the lion's mouth. It's a real tourist trap. You can see the crowd starting to line up there. But what White was interested in was the tower, and he takes that tower and he gives it to the Judson Memorial Church, 4th Street, just south of Washington Square. And it must have been amazing to see this tower go up, because New York in this time, the towers were all very pointy. They were made out of brownstone, and this suggested that maybe, if not a new sheriff in town, at least there was a sort of a new set of, there was a new paradigm of beauty. White looks at the entrance to Santa Maria, if he was looking at this church in particular, and decided that that wouldn't do it all. So he gives the Judson Memorial this extraordinary piece of eye candy, a Renaissance, dense Renaissance ornament that still sort of retains its coherence in spite of the density of the ornament with which it is realized. Well, my favorite of these memory imagination combines are these two buildings. On the left is a building in Verona called the Loggia del Consigli, the Porch of the Lawyers. The right, you know, is the Torre Orologio in St. Mark's Square in Venice. And he takes these two buildings and he inhales them. And what he exhales is this. This was the headquarters for the New York Herald newspaper, owned by James Gordon Bennett, who was his client for the Newport Casino. And here was a complete newspaper operation in a single building at the intersection of 6th Avenue and Broadway at 34th Street. And it had the editorial offices and business offices on the second floor. The first floor and the basement were the production facilities. And you could, walking down Broadway, you could step into that arcade that you see, and you could look through a plate glass window and you could see the newspaper being printed. I mean, those were the days when newspapers were really, really important. And it must have been amazingly fun just to walk past that building and just stop and to see the presses at work. This is the building that I most regret of Stanford White's no longer exists. It's the building that Charles McKim described as the finest piece of architecture produced by their firm, and it is sadly no more with us. Well, whether or not White stopped off in Spain on his honeymoon, he certainly knew this building. This is the Giralda. It's the tower of the church, the cathedral in Seville. Giralda means weather vane in Spanish, and this started off its life as a minaret in a mosque, but after the expulsion of the Moors, it was Christianized, increased in height given this Renaissance topping, and then finished off with this revolving statue of the Archangel Michael. And White and Mel Wells take this thing and they translate it into their more personal Renaissance idiom, but aided by the fact that they're dealing with a steel-framed structure so that they can make it much more slender than the load-bearing masonry of the Seville. And then they top it off not with an archangel, but with a considerably more profane and considerably less clothed statue of Diana, with the first nude publicly displayed in American sculpture. It offended some, it amused many, but it is, I think, the object that is really represents the architecture or the art of the Gilded Age better than almost anything. That all topped the Madison Square Garden, a building that really changed New Yorkers' expectations of what to demand from their public architecture. I mean, here was a building that took up a huge amount of real estate. It was an entire city block, but it gave so much back. I mean, this is a building that was fun to look at. It was fun to walk by. It was fun to go in. It had a opera house. It had a 12,000-seat arena. It had restaurants. It had nightclubs. You could go up to the tower and you could see as far away as Greenwich, Connecticut. And it changed the skyline of New York. And it also changed Stanford White as well. That I think from this point on, White became the most prominent architect in New York. Commissions kept pouring in, and he is now pretty well established. One of the places where these commissions came in was from this man here. That is Henry McCracken, who was the chancellor of what was then called the City University of New York. It changed its name to New York University. This was the embryonic NYU. And McCracken ran what was essentially a small regional liberal arts university down in Greenwich Village, and his ambition was to create a university that was a big research university on the German model. But to do that, he needed more space, and so he bought 40 acres in the Bronx. He hired Stanford White to master plan the campus and then to design the initial academic buildings, including the first one, which was the Gould Memorial Library you see here. Now, this is what is called a rotunda plan. I mean, the reading room is in the center. It's surrounded by the walls of books with more books that are stuffed in behind it. And if you were doing a rotunda plan, the next stop was to look at the granddaddy of all rotundas, which is the Pantheon in Rome, said to be the most copied or influential building of classical times. So a great many architects looked at the Pantheon and took something away, but I think the good ones all took something slightly different away from the Pantheon. For example, Charles McKim was doing the library at Columbia University at exactly the same time that White was doing the library for NYU. And McKim saw the Pantheon as a kind of a urban space divider, something that defined the space, blocked off an entire wall of a square. And so for Columbia, he got rid of the pediment, he increased the height of the attic, he stretched out, added some more columns. He created a sort of giant backstop for the lawn of Columbia University. But White, I think, looked at the Pantheon really through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson. I mean, I think he looked at it as a kind of a sort of a villa, sort of a Palladian institutional villa, something that held its own in space by its foreground qualities rather than by its massing qualities. And that is what he did for the Gould Memorial Library. It's a building with sort of irresistible foreground qualities. You can see it in this White at work with this combination of compression and release that I was talked about, the ornament that is applied with a sort of a density that approaches saturation, and then he backs off and gives these walls of smooth limestone or lightly variegated brick. So all the time he's doing this, he kind of maintains a coherence. I mean, Stanford White is one of the few architects who could sort of use ornament to that density and still not lose track of what he was doing. It's a little like leading I'm going to go backward for one, it's like leading a 1,000-piece orchestra playing Clair de Lune and having it just come out perfectly. And I can't think of another architect who could do what he did there. Inside, there is a certain amount of compression and release. This is the staircase that leads up to the reading room. And you go up the staircase and you feel as though the stair is a little steeper than you'd like, and the walls are a little narrower, and the ceiling is a little higher, and you get to the top of the stair and you're a little winded. And then you go through those doors at the end, and there is not a single person who comes through those doors for the first or even the 100th time who doesn't sort of stop and take a few deep breaths and see what Stanford White has made as a kind of a present for having climbed those stairs. He could sort of translate the Pantheon into different sort of cultural idioms. Here the Pantheon is presented as a Byzantine building. This is the Madison Square Presbyterian Church. And you know, in terms of, you talk about sort of compression and release, I mean, look at the density of that cornice. There isn't room for a bird to hide in that. And yet at the same time, the building just had a serene quality to it. He could work in other languages as well. This is the Grand Trianon in Versailles. This is the building that Louis XIV built to entertain his mistresses. And Stanford White sort of admired the one-story scale of that, the ABA rhythm of solids and voids, the pairs of columns bracketing the arched windows. And he took that and he gave it to John Jacob Astor up in Rhinebeck, New York, for this building, which was a building built to house the male bachelor guests at the Astor weekend house parties. The rooms for the male bachelor guests are actually on the right there because it's filled with some other goodies as well, including the front hall where you could take helicopter lessons. But look at the elements that Stanford White has combined here. The plaster ornamental ring around that shallow dome looks like it could be sort of taken off a Botticelli painting. The fireplace, on the other hand, looks like it's taken out of some sort of warmongering medieval castle. And then the column capitals have this, they are called French Ionic with those little tassels. I mean, very, very delicate. And then the French doors have these transoms that look as though they owe a lot more to the celebrated New England walking tour than to Versailles. And this is Stanford White. This is how he operated. I mean, he took elements from different cultures and different periods, and if they looked good and if they worked well together, he would combine them. I mean, he was just a genius at this. Today, I think you'd probably call it cultural appropriation, but it was, in Stanford White's hands, it was just the making of beauty. The building has an indoor tennis court, which they did with the Guastavinos, and an indoor swimming pool, the first or second indoor swimming pool in America. The other one would be at Biltmore, sort of a tie for first place. But look at the swimming pool. I mean, just white and blue. I mean, that's how he did it. And yet it has this sort of extraordinary spirit to it. And I think the source of that spirit is seen in these column capitals with the porpoises sort of emerging from the foliate leaves. I mean, just the sprinkling of spice in this room to bring it to life. And I think that that is the next thing about Stanford White to keep in mind, that Stanford White really did bring spirit to his designs, but it wasn't just spirit for its own sake. It was spirit that was really tailored to the user and the use and the program that he was doing. So the nature of the spirit changes depending on what the design is. And I think the best illustration of that is seen in the clubs that Stanford White did in New York. I mean, take, for example, the Century Association, where White, with Wells' help, was dealing with a club that had the membership of which was, there were artists, sculptors, painters, journalists, poets, even architects. And what Wells and White were trying to do was to create an elevation that suggested that what was going on inside the building had the artistic, frenetic quality of Florence in the 15th century. Whereas 20 blocks to the south, he's doing the Players Club on Gramercy Park. The Players was a club of actors, and in the 19th century, being an actor was not an esteemed profession. And if you were an actor and this was your club, you would look at those front doors and feel as though what lay on the other side of them was a world of sort of safety and security and serenity. And for an actor, that must have been an extremely welcome sight. This 20 blocks, or actually not even 26 blocks to the north, is 28th Street and Madison Avenue. This was the first bespoke women's club in America. This is the Colony Club, and what White is now, this is now 1902. White has now become a Federal Revival architect after all those years, and he is using the Federal Revival idiom to, I think, express the seriousness of the women who had founded this club and run it, but at the same time, I think he's not hedging his bets, but he's saying that there's something a little bit more going on, and there are these sort of arts and crafts details to that elevation, such as the coal that's stuck into the mortar joints over the arch and the entrance that suggests that this isn't just straight Federal Revival. There's something original about this, and that is how he felt about his clients. Back up to 60th Street and 5th Avenue, this is the club for the Metropolitan Club for the bankers and railroad men. This was the Millionaires Club, where that was, in those days, that was, the definition of that was that you had to make $1 million a year. And so he gives them a building that is based on the Palazzo Farnese, so he's off to a good start in the spirit department. And then he gives them a gate that it looks like it should be in front of Buckingham Palace. So already these guys are feeling pretty good. They get out of their carriages and go in through the door, go through this sort of series of layers where every layer seems to just lead to something better and better. And then finally, sort of at the end, they look up, and I think they would feel as though their self-esteem had been recognized and satisfied. This is the architecture of the Gilded Age, literally. White's architecture was processional. I mean, it was important to move through it. Here is the greatest of his processional designs, the Washington Memorial Arch down in Washington Square, originally designed as a temporary structure out of paper mache and wood to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the birth of George Washington, but everybody liked it so much that they raised money, including pennies from school children, to move the thing onto parkland and build it in marble. But it became this sort of element that's celebrated at the beginning or the end of every decent parade that went up and down Fifth Avenue. Well, today we can't go through it in our open touring cars, sadly, because they put these bollards in front of it. You can see it. But it's still, I think, one of a handful of structures that defines New York City. I mean, you take that away, and I think you have lost something to New York that cannot be replaced or duplicated. The statues of Washington at the bottom were done by the father of Alexander Calder, but the statues above all the sculpture above the first cornice line were done by Frederick McMonnies, who was a sculptor who was a friend of the Whites. He was a frequent house guest out at Box Hill, the Whites' country house in St. James, and I think that as payment for that, he carved Bessie into the upper left spandrel of this, and it shows that it's very important to invite good sculptors to your house parties, because who knows, you could really win big. Stanford White went to a lot of parties, Bessie not so much, but he went to these parties really as a professional. He wasn't going to have a good time. He was going as a kind of obligation. He would complain that he had to work all day and then get dressed up and do the party thing at night, but he was doing it. You see him in the back there. He's doing it, I think, to keep an eye on his clients. That's Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish sitting on the left, on the right, I'm sorry, and possibly keep an eye on the competition, possibly look for more work, but also to just see how parties work, because Stanford White really understood the relationship between architecture and parties. I've always said that if you go to a party in a room designed by Stanford White, you're going to have more fun because the room is going to do half the work. The great example of Stanford White's design of a party house is this house in Newport, Rhode Island. It's called Rosecliff. It was designed for Tessie Ulrichs, the heiress to the Comstock Lode fortune. And what she wanted from White was a house that would allow her to give the single best party in a 60-day social season in Newport. I mean, there was the competition for parties there was fierce, and she wanted to give the best. So he gets the job, and he does the job. And if you were invited to this party, your pleasure with this party would really begin as you were sort of going down Bellevue Avenue, which is a processional route, holding onto your invitation, and your carriage or your car would turn down and go down the driveway, and you'd be heading towards the house. And if you were looking and thinking about it, you would notice two things. First of all, this house was based on the Grand Trianon with an extra story, because Tessie had a lot of house guests. And the second thing you'd notice is that the front door is not in the center of the house, which was unique among houses in Newport. And it was essential to Stanford White's design for making this a party house. So your carriage pulls up in front of that off-center front door. You might notice that Stanford White had not lost his taste for the decorative character of slightly bizarre or extremely bizarre animals. And you go through the front door, you go through a series of layers, and then you would arrive at the bottom of the steps. And if you were with your wife or your fiancé or your sister, you would wait, the men would wait downstairs at the bottom of the stairs, and then the women would go upstairs to straighten their dresses, take a look in the mirror, turn around, and then they would descend the most romantic staircase in America. And that is not an uncritical observation, because I defy you to name one that beats that. I mean, you are having the best time in your life at a party, and you haven't even gotten to the party yet. You have to go through, collect your date, go through another room, say hello to your hostess, go through another room, meet the rest of the guests. I mean, you could actually go home at this point and have had a really great time, but you keep going. It is an amazing, amazing staircase. This house saw a lot of parties too. This is the house that White designed for Payne and Helen Hay Whitney on Fifth Avenue between 78th and 79th. Here, as a party house, White didn't have the runway that he had at Rosecliff to kind of build your expectations and make that transitional space between sort of arriving and then actually being at the party. And so he had to be a little bit cleverer because he didn't have the room. And what he looked at was buildings such as this. This is the Villa Papa Giulia in Rome with this wonderful horseshoe-shaped arcade with an open row of columns and a vaulted ceiling. But what he's looking at is the columns and the treatment of the ceiling with those vines growing in and around lattice work, and then those medallions of allegorical figures. And White picks up on the allegorical figures, but remember, this was a house designed for a young married couple, so the allegories are all allegories of love and fertility, which we see here. But the space itself has these columns, this shallow dome, and what he creates is a kind of an outdoor space indoors, the ring of columns supporting the shallow dome create a structure that has no walls. The walls are just beyond it. And so it's like a structure in the landscape. And to reinforce that, he creates this fountain in the middle of it with bits of antique sculpture that he'd picked up from various Roman dealers, including that statue of the young boy, which now is recognized as the work of the very young Michelangelo. I mean, Stanford White, if nothing, had a really great eye for this stuff. And so if you were going to one of the parties given by the Whitneys, you would go up that staircase on the left. But if you were going to see Mr. or Mrs. Whitney by appointment, you would be shown through the door on the right and into what is called the Venetian room. And remember, I talked about how he did this ornament that was revealed and then dissolved by light. Well, here, this room is dissolving all around you while you're sitting in it. It must have been a hallucinogenic experience to be waiting in here. That it does all of the things I talked about before, the density, the saturation, the coherence, the estuarial middle ground between architecture and furniture. I mean, you're not quite sure whether this is a piece of architecture or you're just inside a giant sort of jewel box. And that wonderful coved cornice there is the surface that's not quite a surface. It's with the roses growing in and out of it, sort of like Bavarian Rococo candlesticks, except I think it actually was based on that clock, which is sitting on the mantelpiece, which Stanford White picked up and gave to the Whitneys as a present. But this shows Stanford White stepping on the gas and still making sense. Stanford White could also step on the brake. This is the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn, building that was, not a building, a structure that was intended to honor the 3,000 colonial prisoners who died in prisoner of war ships in Wallabout Bay in Brooklyn during the Revolutionary War. It was a really disgraceful episode in the history of warfare, and their bones are underneath it. But you can see what White has done here is with no ornament whatsoever, he is creating a statement that is louder than almost anything you can imagine. It shows the power of Stanford White's restraint. Well, I'm going to end up here. This is a picture taken at Box Hill, which is Stanford White's country house in St. James, Long Island, about 50 miles out, which my family still owns. And there is on the left-hand side, sitting in those rocking chairs, are James and Frances Breeze, the couple for whom he did that house in Southampton that you saw at the beginning of the lecture. But the main characters are on the right, center and the right. There is Augustus St. Gaudens sitting in the back looking at the camera, Charles McKim with the white hat with his back to the camera, and Stanford White sitting on the blanket with Bessie tugging his ear for some reason. And so, about 30 years earlier, 27 years earlier, these were just three carefree guys who were heading down the Rhone to look at a little architecture and have a good time, and now they were at the absolute pinnacle of their professions. Augustus St. Gaudens was redesigning the coinage for the United States Mint at the request of Teddy Roosevelt. Charles McKim had just returned from England, where he'd been given the gold medal by the Royal Institute of British Architects, and Stanford White was simply the most famous architect in America. Well, less than a year after this photograph was taken, it all started to come apart. Stanford White was shot by a madman. St. Gaudens, within a year or two, would die from stomach cancer. He lost his battle there. And by 1909, Charles McKim had died, I am convinced, of a broken heart. But if you sort of look forward, there's a melancholy aspect to this photograph. But taken at face value, I think it represents an extraordinary moment in the history of American arts, and it's been my pleasure to share it with you. Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions. The only problem is because I'm staring into these theatrical lights, you might be waving your hand furiously and I won't see you, but I'll give it a try.
Yes, sir.
You said something about the Penn Station and New The question is about Penn Station in New York. Well, there are many questions about Penn Station, including the most current questions about Penn Station, which is what to do with that appalling mess. Well, no, Stanford White had been dead for several years by the time Penn Station opened. I don't think Stanford White laid a finger on Penn Station, just to make that. But on the other hand, White had been important in creating an office that was capable of bringing the art of Penn Station to reality. I mean, those people who were still in the office, who were not shot, were people who, many of whom were people who admired Stanford White, who believed in what he was doing. And so I think that so spiritually, Stanford White was a contributor to Penn Station, but Penn Station is really the work of Charles McKim, and I think that is where most of the credit goes. Yes, sir.
Yes, did McKim, Mead, and White do work in the 1920s, and when did it dissolve?
So the question was whether McKim, Mead, and White did work in the 1920s and when they dissolved. So the answer is, in reverse order, McKim, Mead, and White as a firm dissolved in 1956 when my grandfather, Larry White, died. The rules of the partnership were that you had to have worked with one of the founding partners in order for the firm to continue, and he had, as a young man, had worked with Mead. So as long as he was the senior partner, McKim, Mead, and White could still exist. They were at that time doing the Museum of American History on the Mall in Washington, D.C., place where you go to see the First Lady's inaugural gowns, and because we've all been there. And so that was 1956. In the 20s, they were doing work. They were, but I think under William Mitchell Kendall, who's the leader of the second generation of partners, Kendall was the architect who really he won the competition for the municipal building down by City Hall. He won the competition for the post office building across the street from Penn Station. William Mitchell Kendall was a serious architect, but I think that a lot of things were changing. I mean, the Depression came, and then World War II came, and it was just a terrible time to be an architect. My poor grandfather, I have to say, unfortunately, he fought in 2 world wars and through a depression, and so he didn't have the opportunities that his father had to do these amazing buildings. But they were still there, yes. Yes, sir.
Not an architectural question. What did Weeks die of? What did Weeks die of? He died young?
Oh, Weeks, I think it was consumption. I think it was, I think Weeks died of consumption. John Wells, are we talking about Wells?
Wells, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Wells, yeah. Wells died of consumption. I mean, he was not a healthy guy, and he just died at home. He was sick. Interesting, he came from a very interesting family. His brother was the great mathematician at MIT, and apparently the family just only had enough money to send one of them to college, and so they sent the brother to college, and he became this kind of star, math star, and Joseph Morrow Wells had kind of earn his own way, and I think you could see there was a little sardonic bitterness in that remark that he made about the work of the firm. Yes, sir.
Talk about his legacy and the impact on American architecture.
The impact of.
On American architecture.
Well, the question is the impact of American architecture on Stanford White. White's timing was good in that very shortly after he died, White's style really went out of favor. I mean, the architecture became a lot sparer, that sort of over the top, something like the ceiling in the Metropolitan Club never would have happened in the teens. So White was able to do that work at a time when it was accepted. So I think that I think architecture really moved away from Stanford White after his death, and he had the good fortune, if you want to say it, to not have to see that. What he would have done, I don't know. Yes, sir. Oh, ma'am.
What was did the firm of McKim, Mead, and White have anything to do with the Columbia Exposition of 1890?
The question was whether the firm had anything to do with the Columbian Exposition of 1893, and the short answer is yes, a great deal to do. McKim, I think, really was the person who persuaded the other architects to all sort of toe the line and design buildings that were, in a classical style, in white, had a consistent cornice line, so what you got was a planned community with architectural coherence, with the exception of Louis Sullivan, who came up with a very original building. Louis Sullivan said that the Centennial Exposition set American architecture back 100 years, but McKim McKim was, I think, really the spiritual leader in a very quiet way of getting everybody to come up with a coherent plan. And they did one of the big buildings, the architecture building. Stanford White did a couple of small buildings, the New York State Pavilion. He did a White Star Line Pavilion. He did a little building for the Puck magazine. So he did some work too. Yes, sir.
About the newspaper building that Sam was I was wondering why that was allowed to be taken down. Is that a question of money?
You're talking about the Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church? Oh, the newspaper building. I don't know. I mean, when you consider what replaced it as such dreck, I mean, it's really, it's really a tragedy. I mean, not only for taking it down, but then for what's there in its place. I think it must have not been, Stanford White's buildings did not always work well for the function, so maybe as a building for a newspaper, it was too small. Business offices got bigger, reporters started wanting their own desks. I mean, it may just simply have not worked, but whatever happened, down it came. And there's fragments of it. If you go to that intersection, you will see the bell ringer. The front of that building had a guy with a sledgehammer sort of ringing a bell on the hour. That bronze statue is still there at the intersection of Broadway and 6th Avenue at 35th Street. And then there are little owls that are sort of located around Herald Square. The owl was James Gordon Bennett's sort of personal motto. I'm not quite sure what you would call it, but I think Stanford White at one point was working on a tomb for James Gordon Bennett, which was a monumental owl. This is what I've heard. I mean, a really giant thing. Anyway, never got built, never even really got drawn. Okay, one in the back, and then John wants to kick us out. Yes, sir. Yes. The question is whether I participated in the restoration of the Astor Casino in Rhinebeck and whether I contributed any of my own personal style. And the answers to those questions are yes and no. Yes, I did the kitchen. But I think everything else was in pretty, the architecture of that space was wonderful. That is where Chelsea Clinton got married. I mean, after we were through fixing it up the first time, the Clintons liked it because it reminded Chelsea Clinton of the White House, which she was looking for a place up in that neighborhood to get married, and it was one of 3 places she looked at. And she said that it reminded her of the White House, which was absolutely correct, because that was a 1902 building. In 1903, the McKim, Mead White rebuilt the White House, so it was the same architect, the same period, and of course it reminded her of the White House. So that was a pretty amazing wedding. I was always convinced, that project, I finished that project in 2004. I'm going to get my dates slightly, I think maybe 2008. I'm going to get my dates wrong. Anyway, I finished it, and there was this huge article in the New York Times about the restoration. Really great article, sort of 2 days after Barack Obama was elected. And I was convinced that Michelle was going to call me up, and she didn't. So I'm back at work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a terrific lecture. Thank you all for being here. I hope to see you here next week for a lecture on Julia Morgan and by Dr. Karen McNeil. Thank you again to our sponsors, Related Southeast, First Republic Bank, and Smith Architecture.